Well, hello, everyone. Um, I'm Lindoy Hirabayashi, the president of the Toronto NAJC, and I am here just to do a little introduction with the president of the Edmonton Japanese Community Association, Paul. I'm not sure if I see Paul yet here on the screen. If Diane, if you can spotlight Paul so we can be side by side, that would be great. So I greet you from Toronto, which is the Dish with One Spoon territory. And the Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. The NAJC Gordon Hirabayashi Human Rights Award brings us together tonight for a second year. The award was the idea of Mike Murakami, who lived in Edmonton many years before moving to Toronto in 2008. And Mike got the idea for the award after a discussion with Susan Carnahan, Gordon's widow, on where to archive Gordon's papers related to his involvement with Japanese Canadian communities. Those papers were actually originally in Toronto, but with Ansu Nahara's help, Mike arranged for them to be sent to U of A. And he made it his mission when he was a Toronto NAJC board member to create an award to honor Gordon. And Mike is now a member of our Elders Council. So the award was fittingly unveiled at the 2012 NAJC AGM in Edmonton, where Gordon spent the majority of his years. And Mike met Gordon around 1976 when he was recruited to work on the EJCA Heritage Day Pavilion by George Yamada, the publisher of Rika magazine. As well, Mike's mother, Eiko Murakami, and Gordon were EJCA board members on the seniors committee, and the few meetings were held at Mike's home. And he recalls many interesting conversations with Gordon, which inspired him to get involved with Edmonton organizations like the John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights and the Center for Race and Culture. Well, last year, Matt Miwa read from the play and had a chat with Jeannie Sakata, the playwright. And this led to a remarkable initiative by the EJCA, led by Oliver Rossier and the drama department at U of A, to mount the first Canadian production of Hold These Truths. So this year, we will hear about Gordon from Dr. Henry Shimizu, who is 93 years old. He has sent a video, and Ansu Nahara, and that will be followed by a 4-minute reading and Q&A with Kevin Takahide Lee. And he is playing Hirabayashi in this new production. After that, there will be a discussion with the Edmontonians involved in this great initiative. I just want to mention the video is a little longer than I thought, so we are going to go a little over time, over the hour. So about the award. So briefly, a nominee can be an individual or group committed to the mission statement of the NAJC, which is to strive for equal rights and liberties for all people, particularly racial and ethnic minorities. The nominee must live and operate in Canada, and the award will not be given posthumously. And the nominee may or may not be of Japanese descent or a member of the NAJC, but should be supportive of the NAJC mandate. So please check our website for complete details. The deadline for nominations is July 31st, and the winner will be announced at our AGM in September. So Gordon Hirabayashi was beloved by the Japanese Canadian community, both locally and nationally. In keeping his memory alive, we transcend the limits of time, which allows us to be emboldened by his love of justice. So now over to Paul Fujishige, president of the EJCA. He's been a member of the EJCA for several years and a member of the Matsui no Kai senior group, a board member, and now is in his second year as president. He'll say a few words about the EJCA and maybe correct me if I've gotten any of that information wrong. So thank you, Paul. It's great to see you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. And I'm hoping you can hear me because I've been having some audio problems, but no one's saying they can't.
Hear you. Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm very pleased to be here this evening, and thanks to Lynn for inviting me and our association. It's going back over a year now that we've become more active in the area of human rights. I'd like to begin by saying we have on our website now put a statement about Indigenous territories. So I'll just read you what we have now on our website. EJCA is located on Treaty 6 territory, respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. We are grateful for Indigenous people who are the traditional stewards of the land and waters where we work and live. So this statement is now on our website, and you'll see that in other places coming up. Back in 2020, we started a committee of EJCA called CARE, which you'll hear more about, Committee Advocating for Racial Equality. And a number of activists, I would call them, all activists got on board, and you'll be hearing some of them tonight as well. I think it's fair to say that what we've been doing since then has been to, on many different fronts. One is to raise the profile of Gordon Hirabayashi. He's a noted Edmontonian. I understand he spent more than 50 years as a resident and citizen of Edmonton. He taught at the University of Alberta in the sociology department. His early life is what's highlighted in this play, but even his later life, he was quite active in Canada and in some of the things that were going on in Canada, redress being one of them in the late 1980s. So I think one of our objectives is, as I said, to raise his profile, and not just this play, but other events that we are looking at over the next year or two to not just the Japanese Canadian community, but also the community at large in Edmonton and Alberta, because he's a man that should be celebrated for what he brought to our country, our province, and our city. And so there'll be other ways that we'll be looking at highlighting that. And I believe Oliver will be talking a little more about that later. The other thing I would say that's happened is a lot of partnerships have started. Partnerships with other organizations who believe in some of the same fundamental things we do. I think for EJCA, it was always there, but it was more in the background over recent years. And I think recently we've raised it to the foreground to say, rights are the foundation from which EJCA was founded, over 75 years ago. But we've kind of, I wouldn't say we've lost our way, but it hasn't taken as much priority as we're starting to give it now. And I think what's happened in our society over recent years has meant it's very timely for us to be picking up on this again. And the play is another example of things that we, that highlight what happened 50 years ago was not much different than what's happening again today. So we're very pleased to be involved with that as well. I think that's probably my few minutes for now, and I believe we're going to have the video presented, which is a couple of remembrances about Gordon, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
My name is Dr. Henry Shimizu. I was an old friend of Gordon Hirabayashi, a man of principle. Gordon Hirabayashi was well known and famous and a hero to Japanese Americans. He was well known in the legal and well respected in the legal community. In 1942, Gordon disobeyed the curfew law, and later on He also objected to the executive orders that came from the government to remove Japanese Americans from the West Coast. He was tried. He was tried, and he was charged, and he lost his case. He was jailed and spent 90 days in jail in Tucson, Arizona. In 1987, with coram nobis and retrial in the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeal, his charges were reversed and he was pardoned. And he received a citation from President Ronald Reagan. He received his doctorate in sociology in 1952. He taught in the Middle East, in Beirut and Cairo at the American University. In 1959, he was appointed to the University of Alberta as a professor of sociology. He later on became the head of the department between 1970 and 1975. During this period, the Department of Sociology became one of the outstanding sections in Canada. He contributed to the Indigenous and Métis people when he helped establish the first Native Friendship Center in Edmonton. Subsequently, centers were formed all across Canada. It was an important advance in the Indigenous people in the mosaic of Canadian communities. I first met Gordon at the EAG Center in Edmonton in around 1970. He was helping the center produce their newsletter. Gordon and I became co-chair of the celebration for the Japanese-Canadian centennials. And Gordon made arrangements for the Japanese-Canadian centennial dancers and music that was being organized in Toronto by Roger Obata to come to Alberta. I was to look after the local arrangements and the funding. We were able to get a substantial grant from the government of Alberta, and we had 2 shows in the Citadel Theatre in Edmonton and 1 show at the Max Bell Theatre in Calgary. The shows were very professionally done and very colorful. He became a Canadian citizen, and so he was a dual citizen, continued to contribute to both to the JACL in the United States and the NAJC in Canada. Gordon and I started to play racquetball at the squash courts at the university. And in the summer, would golf with the Edmonton Japanese Canadian group. We started skiing at local hills. And in the spring of 1983, Gordon became a senior citizen. We took a trip to Jasper, used the log cabin which we owned in Jasper. Gordon felt that he would like to contribute for the weekend, and he said that he would go and get the tags and tickets for the ski hill and ski lift. Went to the office, and he told them that he was a senior. They at the office said that they would give him 2 tags and tickets for 2 days for the ski lifts. And he returned with these freebies, all smiles, because I still thought that he was going to have to buy them. In 1986, Gordon married Susan Carnahan at a private ceremony at the Quaker Church. Gordon was a natty dresser. His academic attire involved a white shirt with a bow tie and a brownish tweed jacket. He was always very neat. He enjoyed very much living in his modern house in the Windsor Park, which was next to the University of Alberta. After using ours jacuzzi, Gordon decided he would build a Japanese ofuro in his own house. He loved Japanese food, and we would go to the Shogun restaurant for Japanese food. In the 90s, we began to notice that Gordon was having trouble keeping his golf scores. In 2006, the EJCA celebrated his 88th birthday with a party, and at the end, Gordon got up to speak, and he said thank you to all of us, and then he could not say anything more. Joan and I moved to Victoria in May of 2006. We visited Gordon and Susan a few years later, and I noticed at that time that Gordon was looking frailer, and that I wasn't sure that he recognized me. Gordon passed away in January 2012, and he was awarded the Medal of Freedom posthumously. His wife Susan and family received the medal in Washington from the President Obama.
I'm Anne Sunohara, the author of the book, The Politics of Racism, The Uprooting of Japanese Canadians During the Second World War. I wrote this book in the 1970s in Alberta at a time of which I had the opportunity to socialize with and discuss things with Gordon Hirabayashi, who at the time was on the faculty of the Department of Sociology at the University of Alberta. And he was there because he couldn't work in the United States in the 50s and 60s as a consequence of having a felony conviction for attempting to protect his constitutional rights, his refusal to obey the curfew, his refusal to turn up to be removed from the coast, and finally, his refusal to serve in the military on the basis that he was a Quaker conscientious objector. At that time, it would seem that if you had a felony conviction, you were not considered morally appropriate to be educating young people in colleges in the United States. As a consequence, he had gone overseas and had been working in Egypt and at the American University in Beirut, until the University of Alberta recruited him, brought him to Alberta as at first as a sociologist, and then in 1970, the president of the university asked him to design and form the Department of Sociology in the Faculty of Arts, which he did. And that was where he was when I met him. The other matter which may interest you is that Gordon did discuss his adventures, as he called them, with me, but he had only one regret for taking the stance he did, and that regret arose from the way in which the US prosecutor proved he was Japanese for the purpose of prosecuting him. Gordon didn't know they would do this, but the American authorities went to the camp in which his parents were residing, escorted them to the courthouse in which Gordon was being tried. And because they were Japanese and could not stay in a hotel or anything of that sort, imprisoned them in the jail the night before so that his mother and father could testify that they were Japanese and he was their son. He told me later that he always felt horrible that his mother had had to go through 2 nights of staying in a jail cell in order to testify at his hearing. He did, by the way, get a chance to apologize to her, because at one point after he'd served his time and and before he could serve the selective service part of it later, he ran into a problem because they had no arrangements for transferring him from where he was being imprisoned in Washington state to the alternative place, which was somewhere down in New Mexico, I believe, or Arizona, one of the two. So Gordon hitchhiked between them. They couldn't spare anybody to escort him. He hitchhiked, but he did it via the camp in which his parents were being held in Utah, so he could apologize to his mother. Then he attended a Quaker conference somewhere between there and New Mexico. And then he had to persuade the people at the place he was supposed to be incarcerated that yes, he was the one they were supposed to be incarcerating. And those are my Gordon stories.
We're really grateful that Henry agreed to make the video. It's so meaningful to hear about Gordon's life from the perspective of a longtime friend, and also to Roy Katsuyama for making the video, helping Henry make the video, and for Ann Sunahara. I had an interesting conversation with her because she was very involved in helping write the Emergency Powers Act. So when I interviewed her, it was around that time with the convoy in Ottawa. But anyway, that conversation is off the record, but maybe an interview for the future. So I'm very pleased to introduce this next video, which is a video of a snippet of a performance by Kevin Takahide Lee from the upcoming play. So Kevin is a Yonsei, and he's a firm believer that the arts must be interwoven with social needs. After graduating from UBC and UWO in opera and voice performance, he has been involved with productions focusing on bringing attention to BIPOC stories. And this includes producing and directing a multicultural choir on exhibit at the National Museum for Human Rights. And for the past 10 years, he's been sitting on the Powell Street Festival's programming committee. He's particularly interested in telling Japanese Canadian stories. And he's currently in his 9th season, portraying Zenosuke Inoue, a Canadian World War I hero and the only Japanese Canadian veteran to get his land back. Well, when he's not focused on production, he's practicing his Japanese and shamisen, which was supported through a NAJC endowment grant in 2021. So we will go on to this video performance.
You are under arrest. Dear Howie, things are so quiet here on Jefferson Street. The sun out, air lazy. It's very difficult to realize that everything that has happened in the last 3 days has actually happened. I'm now being guarded by 2 splendid privates, an Earl Hawley of Tennessee and a Joseph Jones of Alabama. And boy, do these 2 have the accent. A Captain Ravistow from the U.S. Army calls me into his office. He offers a cup of coffee, cream and sugar, a napkin. He informs me of the success of the uprooting process. 100% cooperation in Northern California, 100% cooperation in Southern California. And when we finish our talk, he says he's confident we can achieve the same for Washington State. Now, God, here's a proposal. We feel it's a shame that your studies have been disrupted by this court order, so we're willing to offer you early release if you agree to sign and register. Thank you for the offer, but my answer has to be no. It's a matter of principle. Well, let's talk about principle, huh? The principle of family. What if we offered your entire family early release? Mitsu and Shogo, Edward James, Richard Little, Toshiko? I'm sorry, I can't do it. Well, what about this? What if the Army kicked in a scholarship for your brother's schooling? We know about Eddie's aspirations to go to college back east. I'm sorry. Gordy, the number of charges against you could result in a very long prison term. Captain Ravistow speaking! Oh, hello, Colonel. It's going very well, sir. I'm sure we'll have it squared away soon. Well, no, he hasn't. But talk's been very fruitful, sir, and... yes, I tried that. Yes, I tried that too. Yes, I know you are. I'm sorry, sir. Goodbye. Captain Ravistow hangs up shaken. I ask him if there's something wrong. The call was from the National Defense in San Francisco. Apparently, his superiors at the Presidio are very interested in the outcome of our talk. Captain Ravistow, look, I know you're just doing your job, and I hope you're not in any hot water just because of me. Well, let's say it would help us all if you agreed to register. I look at Ravistow's desk, a photo, his wife and baby girl. We sit there racking our brains. Captain Ravistow, I got it. What if you got a couple of men to forcibly carry me to your car, drive me to the camp, and drop me off at the entrance? That way you'll get your 100%, and I won't be breaking my principles. You know that just might work, guy. Wait, no, we can't do it, we can't. Military orders strictly state everyone inside the camp must be signed and registered. Otherwise, you'll be breaking the law. Breaking the law.
We're waiting for Kevin now, but I will say bravo, Kevin. There is a little bit of humor in that as well. It's the second time I've seen it. In the bio, it wasn't included that you also, on one side, you are Chinese Canadian.
Yes,
Is that right?
I am as well. Yes, that is correct.
So, and Chinese Canadian in that coming from a generation where your family experienced the head tax.
That
Is
is
that right?
correct too. Yes, that is correct. Both of my Chinese and Japanese family came to Canada back in the late 1800s. So they had a lot of parallel experiences. And a part of my exploration of my identity, of my creative outlets, has been exploring both of those cultures. And it's quite incredible what one finds when you just start to dig. The things, the not things, but the little and large intricacies of racism that is dotted throughout that time period, which is points to a systemic problem. I find that a very key thing to point to, just because, and I think one thing that is really great about Gordon's story is, and just the Japanese Canadian and Japanese American story, is the fact of identifying a group of people just based upon a race because there's something going on in the world. And if I'm not mistaken, it was Art Mickey not too long ago who was mentioning the concern around repercussions against the Russian Canadian population. So I think that when it comes to Gordon's story and many other Japanese Canadian American stories, it's something that relates to a very broad face of Canada.
Yes, that's a good point you raised about Art Mickey, the video statement that he made for the CBC, because I think that was on the minds of a lot of Japanese Canadians. So we were all very grateful that he articulated that and did that so well. It's definitely a danger. And then also with the COVID pandemic, the backlash, the racism against Chinese Canadians.
Yeah, that's something that I experienced in Vancouver. Not that I haven't experienced before, but it did shock me that it was so public, in such a public place. Whenever I've experienced racism of that level, it's just generally when I'm walking by myself without anyone around me. So without a doubt, it did rear its ugly head.
Yes, and the buildings in Vancouver's Chinatown are just regularly vandalized, and I guess I've read, well, being from Toronto, read that so much money and time is being spent by the businesses and organizations to deal with all that, the graffiti and the vandalism. It's very sad.
It's also a very complex issue. Not only does it relate to racial issues, but also social economic issues. One of the facts about Chinatown throughout North America is that's where often enough the city dumped, if I can use that term, its socially economic lower class, if I can use that term. So that it's a very contentious issue with no straightforward answers, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and there was a time when cities, I'm not sure which cities, but would not even do garbage pickup in Chinatown.
Yeah,
and there are a lot of issues. But yes, in regard to the similarities in Japanese Canadian, Chinese Canadian, I mean, British Columbia had, I think, a total of 170 pieces of discriminatory legislation, which affected Asians, South Asians, Chinese Canadians, and Japanese Canadians. I'm not sure where people are being very shy about asking questions.
Yeah, that's all right.
So I guess
how about if I talk about some of the process of figuring out who Gordon is, and a large part of that is luckily when I've done roles, one of them being Zenitsuke Inoue. Unfortunately, there are no videos of him. There are photos, but since he came to Canada in 1900 and he died in the 60s, there's no audio or video documentation of him. But with Gordon Hirabayashi, there is so much, and it's such a treasure trove of information. But naturally, it's of him later in life when he's here in Edmonton. Nothing really before that. So going through his and I know that Jeannie did it as well, Jeannie Sakata, the playwright, but going through his old entries, the letters that he sent, the correspondence, and there's an incredible, I encourage a lot of people to read it if you haven't. It's called A Principled Stand. It's basically a biography about his life. And one thing that I hope people get from the play is Gordon is not just a sociologist. He's not just a activist. He is a philosopher. He's a deep thinker. He tries to live his life by with such dedication to principles that go unbroken. When I was reading the book, there was one instance, and it is slightly brought up in the play, but not to the same degree, about when he becomes, in essence, the mayor of a prison. And it happens democratically. And he's telling, and Japanese of that time, even Japanese of today, not particularly tall. So he's in prison with these white, black men who tower above him. And he's able to diffuse tension. And eventually they recognize his ability as a leader, as a democratic leader. So they asked him to take responsibility of their funds. And he tells them, I'll do this for 2 weeks. And then after that, you can determine if you actually want me to do this. And they say yes. And I think there were a lot of people saying yes. I think when Gordon came to Edmonton, there was a lot of yes from the Edmonton community as well. And I see that someone posted, what is the name of the book? The name is A Principled Stand here. Unfortunately, I couldn't get my hands on my own copy, so I got this from the Vancouver Public Library. So please check it out. Don't check it out until I'm able to get back to the Vancouver Public Library, because I don't want to be collecting any more fees than I have to. But I highly recommend this one, and just any book about Gordon. He was an exceptionally good essayist. And there you go. Thank you all for posting that.
Yes, that's interesting. I hadn't heard of that book, but I actually, funnily enough, I was reading a book, a biography of Leo Tolstoy a few months ago, and I discovered that Leo Tolstoy was involved with the Doukhobors. He brought the Doukhobors to Canada, and that actually Gordon had written, I think, one of his papers on the Doukhobors. Yes. So that relates to what you were saying about the deep dive into the philosophy and the feeling and passion he had for connecting to the spirit of nonviolence.
Yeah, he was very shocked about the story of the Doukhobors here in Canada. And I think, if people don't know about the Doukhobors, you should. They're one of the few groups that still have yet to get their reparations. I shouldn't say one of yet, but anyways. But yeah, he in a Quaker pamphlet, he wrote about them as well, and that's where I got some of that information. I tried to find his essay that he wrote. Apparently it was through UBC as well, which kind of confused me, but there's a lot of good stuff to read from Gordon.
Yes, that's a good point, because on the issue of who has been denied the franchise, the Doukhobors were among that group, I believe. Although, I guess they are remembered for some kind of extreme actions at some point in time. But there is a whole history there that that kind of should be looked at in addition to the
I absolutely agree. And I know for me and my family, some of my members were interned in the Silicon Valley in New Denver. And if it wasn't for the Doukhobors helping them during the winters, because my family stayed in New Denver up to 1949, that's when their internment ended. And the Doukhobors were very helpful getting them through the winters. And if anyone's wondering about the book, it's called Good Times, Bad Times, Idealism is Realism. It looks something like this, if you can see that there. Again, at the Vancouver Public Library, and you can get that one, take that on one out, because I didn't bring that one with me.
Yes, there maybe you'll have to send us those, and we can, in case people don't catch it on the chat, we can send that out to people, because it is very interesting reading, I think.
It is. And one thing that blew my mind. Something that seems to transcend time is being not an issei, but being a yonsei. The balancing act of being Japanese, or in my case, East Asian, and Canadian, or this type of white. And Gordon called it like a schizophrenia. Nowadays, I don't think that would be the right term, but it's this balancing act of, being this way in this environment, being that way in the other environment, but also having a different collection of point of views of work ethic, or just ethics in general. So reading that, reading someone who was going through that in the 1930s, which I've gone through that regularly and still realize more and more about it. It's something that makes me understand and relate to Gordon more. And I think anyone who sees their play or reads more about Gordon, you'll find a lot of different characteristics about him that you'll relate to.
And he must have been a very outgoing person, because he's really made so many people across Canada have had conversations with him. My mother's had conversation with him. He used to stay with one of our board elders council board members when he would visit Toronto. Everyone has a Gordon story. So, I mean, there's a book that could be written about his time in Canada. Now, did you have a chance to, I know you had seen the chat that Matt Miwa had with Jeannie Sakata last year, but I was wondering, did you have any contact? Did you have conversations with Jeannie?
Oh, yes.
You did?
It was incredible. She is so kind and so encouraging, and she, we just ended up talking and talking and talking. She herself has many Gordon stories, not just from meeting him in person, but also meeting other people, like speaking with his first wife, with one of his first girlfriends, and making Gordon sound like a ladies' man, and perhaps he was. Apparently, he was very charming, but she has many stories about him, and that was absolutely a joy to talk with her. And I particularly enjoyed when she saw me and saw my face. She's like, "You look like him." I'm like, I would hope so. Thank you.
Yes, no, we really enjoyed meeting her online last year. She's definitely got star quality, or she's a real pro too. She yeah. Okay, well, I think then I guess Jim Hoyano just noted that Henry Shimizu, Gordon's friend, was interned in New Denver and came to Edmonton. Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll have to catch up with him. After this, I'm actually doing an internship in Victoria, and maybe I can connect with him. I would love to hear some of his stories. And I know that one of the at the art gallery, one of the individuals that's covering it is also works at the Powell Street Festival. So yeah, that would be great to hear some of his stories too. Thank you.
Right, and then I've posted as well that Henry currently has a show of his work in the art gallery in Victoria, and there's a link there at Arts Victoria, and it's his paintings from the New Denver internment. And Samantha Marsh, a Japanese Canadian, is the curator. So I think I wish I was able to see that, but anyway, for those of you,
travel.
Yeah. So, okay, well, I think now then we can start this, introduce some of the folks in Edmonton who've, pulled this all together. And thank you so much, Kevin. It's really interesting seeing how deeply you research this role. It's really, I'll definitely be following up on those books, and I'm sure others who are here tonight will as well.
Brilliant.
So
thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Alrighty. Bye.
Bye. So now we are going to have a chat with Kevin Higa, Oliver Rossier, and Rene Bourgeois. And this again is going to be fairly informal, but I'm going to ask each to introduce themselves briefly. And I think in Kevin's case, he'll speak a bit about the CARE Committee, the NAJC Human Rights Committee, and yeah, I think he'll cover that. Oliver will talk about his involvement with the Edmonton Japanese Cultural Association and how he got the ball rolling. A big snowball, it's really snowballed to get this production happening, and then maybe just acknowledge some of the folks, the many folks at the U of A drama department and elsewhere who supported this. And then Rene is part of the follow-up team that will host a panel discussion on the 25th, right? No, 24th? 25th of April, just, to discuss the content of the play and the implications then and now. So Kevin, can we start with you?
Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Higa, and I am here in my home in Edmonton, which is on Treaty 6 land and is a Treaty 6 territory and is the traditional gathering place for many Indigenous people and the Métis Nation. And I'm just going to talk to you real quick that I am a member of the AGCA CARE Committee, and I just love what CARE stands for, which is Committee Advocating for Racial Equality. And I think that is such a fantastic name for CARE. And I'm also part of the NAJC Human Rights Committee. And just recently, I was put on the nomination committee for the Gordon Hirabayashi Human Rights Award. So I'm really pleased to be put on that committee, especially given that I'm from Edmonton and I went to the University of Alberta. And just want to tell you really quickly why I joined these different human rights committees. And it's basically to learn. And, I wanted to do this to learn about human rights advocacy, to learn about basically Japanese Canadians, and also to make sure that what happened to my parents isn't forgotten with the internment camps and all the other things that happened there. But one thing is, when I joined these committees, is how the lack of knowledge I had about how the Japanese Canadian community did things with respect to human rights and human rights advocacy, and two, how many great people there are with respect to who have Japanese Canadian backgrounds. And another thing that was really impressive to me is that I have never heard about the John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights until actually Lynn told me about it when we were in a NAJC Human Rights Committee. And she told me she's from Toronto, I'm from Edmonton, and I've never even heard about your organization, Renee. So many things that I've learned is starting to just to learn about human rights and how many great groups there are in all the cities that we are. And the other thing is I had never even heard about Gordon Hirabayashi. And I know that when I went to these meetings and it was brought up first by our EJCA CARE Committee, and then Lynn, I think I learned more about Gordon Hirabayashi by listening to Lynn than I had ever heard. I actually truly did not know about him and what he had done. So for me, it's important to get involved with this and basically not only to hear about this, but to tell our stories. And I'm really happy that Oliver, you've helped to get this organized. Lynn in trying to inform us about the play, and everyone else involved with this, because we need to get the knowledge and of Gordon Hirabayashi out to the greater community. And why I say this is I'm a University of Alberta graduate. I'm on many boards at the University of Alberta, and I have been in part of the Japanese Canadian community in Edmonton for 30 years, but I've never knew about the accolades and how much of an amazing person Gordon Hirabayashi was. So that's why I think it's so important to make sure we hold the truth is presented in Edmonton, in Alberta, and across the nation. So that is my story. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you, Kevin. And Kevin, you always ask great questions. And I think you make an important point that you don't have to be an expert to join the Human Rights Committee. So much of it is about learning. So thank you for your openness to that.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll just pick up from there, Lynn. Would you? Yeah. So it feels honestly to me almost like a play. And, you know, my role is a small part. I come in sort of in the third or fifth act, and my job is to help the audience remember really interesting parts of the play that's happened already. So like Kevin, I hadn't even heard of Gordon Hirabayashi. I've worked at the U of A for 20 years. I'm a senior officer in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta. I was a student there as well. I try to be engaged. I try to be active in supporting, building safe spaces for complex dialogues. That's actually, you know, if you take my job description, organizing research projects of various sizes and scales in the humanities, in the social sciences, and in other parts of the arts, create safe spaces for complex dialogues. So when the call came out from the CARE committee to the EJCA community, help, we're facing racism around our communities, plural, what can we do? I answered. I went and Dr. Olenka Bilash joined in. She's a professor in the Faculty of Education and at the University of Alberta. She's also the Honorary Consul General of Japan in Edmonton. And we listened and we learned and we heard earlier in the play, you know, Lynn, you brought together the NAJC talking about Hold These Truths just about a year ago. We took that call. We took that call to action. How is it that, as Kevin said, in Edmonton, the play has never been held and produced in the city he lived in for so many years, at the university that he was the first chair of the Department of Sociology? That can't be. So instantly a call to action for me. First few calls, Faculty of Arts. Have you heard of this amazing gentleman, Dr. Gordon Hirabayashi? What can we do? Absolutely, yes. Let's do something. Prince Takamado Japan Center, same thing. How can we help? Department of Sociology, Department of Drama, Faculty of Education. And as Lynn, you described it, it was a snowball. Especially the early communication went extremely smoothly. And of course, the pandemic. Right, we had the dreams of hosting it live in the various parts of Alberta. For this current round, we are not going to do that. For this initial May run of May 5th through 7th, and I've posted I hope everyone can see the link to the performances on the AGACA website. Hold These Truths. Let me know if you can't reach that. This is the mobilizing moment. We are going to celebrate this beautiful story. We are going to bring the play to Edmonton, and then we are going to, and soon I'll pass the torch to Renee because her amazing organization is the next part. So we build awareness about Gordon Hirabayashi. We listen to the story. And as Dr. Shimizu said, you know, weaving the mosaic. This is an iterative thing. Racism comes, we come with a response. And often, as we know, we turn to arts, humanities, social sciences for responses for these complex situations in our societies. So there's going to be the play. We're going to have the play live in Edmonton. We're going to have a digital version available from May 11th to May 31st as a part of the Asian Heritage Month. And in the weeks after the play, the live play in Edmonton, we're going to be rolling that out. And we're going to be boosting the communication about the panel that Renee is going to help us organize, and also about the amazing work that the John Humphrey Center is doing. And then the third component builds after that, builds on both the play and the panel, and it's going to be a curriculum package led by Dr. Olenka Bilash, with assistance from research assistants in her faculty. And I do want to give a shout out to the research assistants that we've already had engaged. We've had amazing support from Terry Rolfson. I think she may even be on the call. And also we've had help from other research assistants over the time. And we will definitely acknowledge everyone in the programs. And we really look forward to continuing this dialogue. So I'm going to pass the torch to Renee. And it's such a joy to have this, the momentum building around Gordon Hirabayashi and our campaigns against racism.
Thank you, Oliver.
All right, I'll go ahead. Thank you, Oliver and Kevin and Lynn, and for all of you for having us. I'm really honored to be here and have the opportunity to share today, especially kind of honoring such a legendary human rights hero, the late Kiyoshi Hirabayashi. So I'm just going to ramble a little bit, and hopefully I make some sense, because I think I'm coming here as somebody who like Gordon, kind of seeks to speak up about rights. And so I'm just going to share some thoughts and then go into the panel and what to expect. But I think when I've been reflecting on Gordon's story, the thing that really stands out for me is that he really knew the importance of one case as a trial. It just takes one case of systemic issues, a systemic racism issue, to push the Constitution and affirm our values as a society. So he knew that law and the Constitution are values that we need to progressively aspire to and push towards. And for us at the John Humphrey Center, that guiding point is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was drafted by our namesake, John Peters Humphrey, who was actually a Canadian lawyer from out east. So, and when Hirabayashi turned himself into the FBI in his protests against registering for relocation, he was objecting really to the government having that right to incarcerate without due process of law. And the Constitution is this critical document that we must keep alive in our discourse and the work on human rights, because it lays out the limits of the state. So while Hirabayashi's story came from our neighbors south of us, I think Canada is fascinating in that historical moment, because Canada did not have a binding institution that protected all people like the United States. In fact, we had legislation like the Gradual Civilization Act, the Indian Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Sexual Sterilization Act, the Order in Council banning Blacks from entering Canada. So all this legislation built to kind of intentionally exclude or even erase. So thankfully in 1982, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom has set us on a new path. Another thing about Hirabayashi's story, which really brings home to me, is that detainment and incarceration are a starting point for removing an identified community from society. Today, when you look in who in our society is detained and incarcerated, Indigenous, Black, Muslim, migrant, when I think of this land and we stand here on Takahide here in Edmonton, how criminalization was one of the first tools used in the expansion process out here in the West, particularly the prairies. And while my Ukrainian ancestors were coming in to farm the land, leaving harsh and often violent circumstances, which is ironic in the state of what we are today. On the other hand, my Indigenous ancestors were being criminalized in order to remove them from the land, and children taken away in order to kill that Indian and the child. So our welfare system, which has grown out of the 60s scoop, is a continued displacement of children. And we have much work to do on human rights in Edmonton and in Canada. And I think we're only really at the point of realizing Indian residential schools, but the continued forms of removal will become more and more apparent to Canadians as we move along and learn about the impacts of the 60s scoop and onwards. So in our work at the John Humphrey Center, this work is really deep and close to our heart. Canada has a long way to go to live those values. And there's a lot of need for those civil objectors like Hirabayashi to kind of be able to stand up and to removals, erasures, and exclusion. So like Hirabayashi, JHC works hard every day to be those objectors, to speak up, to bring light to human rights issues, to create space for those really hard dialogues, and then to build ways that we can make shifts and adjustments. And those are hard conversations, but absolutely necessary. So we really work to advance dignity, freedom, justice, and security through collaborative relationships and transformative education on peace and human rights. So now with all that, over this next month, we all have that opportunity to learn more about Hirabayashi's story and reflect upon what it means for us as a society today. And I want to urge you all, not only to engage in the performances, maybe the live performances, May 5th to 7th, but those broadcasts and watch them over May. We have this month of learning to do. And I really then want to invite you all to join us on the evening of May 25th to come together after this theater debut and this month of airings and have a discussion about what this means. And we're excited. This discussion will be hosted by none other than a friend of mine, Serena Ma, who's a fierce Edmonton-based storyteller, former CBC journalist. Fascinating story as an Asian Canadian woman from up north in Alberta, and she's a beautiful woman. And that will also include our special guest, including Paul Fuzijieshi. And I know I said that, I just murdered it. I really tried. The names are so important. And I often think my name is quite hard for some people. And we're excited to have Paul join us that day, as well as Aya Fujiwara from Prince Takamado, Japan Center for Teaching and Research Director. So we'll be getting into this conversation, and then following that panel discussion, we'll also have some small group dialogue to unpack the history and talk about real solutions that we have in front of us and inspire our collective spirit and movement around human rights. So over the past year, the John Humphrey Center has been working hard with partners across Alberta in 6 different regions to build community-based action plans to advance human rights, but address racism and discrimination. And we're going to pull that work in order to kind of breathe life into the desires of people who are fighting for justice across this province. So I really encourage you to join us that evening. Let's have some open, honest conversations, and you can follow at JH Center on social media to get the release details, and I'm sure that'll be shared over time. So thank you so much for this space and for the honor of being seen as a kind of a human rights leader, perhaps. Like Jerry Gall, who's one of our founders, was 38 years at the University of Alberta. There's something special about that institution, but how such incredible human rights heroes kind of remain a little bit under the radar in some ways, like Gordon seemed to do. So there's a beautiful thing to that. So thank you so much again, Emma.
Thank you, Renee. That was inspired, and I'm sure we're all really quite, looking forward to this discussion. And of course, I know Serena Ma, and I'm sure you and Serena and Paul, and it's going to be a great event. Also, I think it's really interesting that, as I mentioned earlier, Mike Murakami, who started the award, that he was involved however many decades ago with the John Humphrey Center. So, things are, a spiraling circle, we hope. Okay, so I'm going to call back Paul because he and I will just offer some closing remarks. Yeah, hi, Paul.
Sorry,
okay.
I've heard everything, but I haven't been able to react.
Okay.
So
Brace, so you're going to say a few words, I'll say a few words, and then we'll run the post-event video. Okay.
Well, terrific. As I said, I have been able to listen to the messages. They've been very inspiring. You just feel the momentum. There's a lot of possibilities here, and I think across Canada, to engaging with partners and others to look at human rights maybe in a different way, in a forward-thinking way, and make us all better citizens of our community in the end, I think. There's a long way to go, no sugarcoating. Canada has existed as a nation for many years, and there's been racist overtones all along. And that's not just going to go away tomorrow. But I think there are definitely signs of progress. And I just applaud Gordon Hirabayashi when he stepped forward, when he did. There were very few allies. He wasn't totally by himself, but there weren't very many others. And even within his community, there was a lot of objection and consternation about him taking the stand he did. It was very difficult. Even his own family questioned whether that was the right move. I put on the screen that there's another book that has been recently written that has stories about Gordon Hirabayashi in it, called Facing the Mountain by Daniel James Brown, who's a fairly celebrated author. And there's snippets of Gordon's story throughout. The majority of the story is about the brave Japanese American service people who volunteered to fight and faced huge hardship. Not only did they have the plight of war to deal with, but they had the hatred of their own fellow citizens, but still they persevered. And Gordon's story fits well within that in terms of the perseverance. He chose a non-battle way of dealing with it, but very powerful nonetheless. So I thank everyone who attended this evening. It was enlightening. I find every one of these sessions that we have more enlightening. I learn more about a number of things every time. I appreciate Lynn and the Human Rights Committee of NAJC for the work they do in many areas, and in particular this. And I think it's it's a real tribute to have you folks involved. And it's certainly helped us in Edmonton to get off our rears and get moving. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. It's been great to work with your group, and well, I think you should give yourself more credit. I mean, I just can't believe how this has taken off. And you did make that initial inquiry with me about human rights. So you did start this ball rolling. So I hope that everyone is now really interested, can hardly wait to see Hold These Truths, and also to nominate someone for the Human Rights Award. We are going to put a link to the award info in the chat box. It is on the NAJC website. Last year's recipient was Shin Imai, and he was awarded this for his lifetime of work in human rights, refugee law, and Indigenous rights. He has developed alternative dispute resolution programs, initiated justice projects in Indigenous communities, and is a former faculty member at Osgoode Law School, where he received several excellence in teaching awards. He's now retired, but he's a director of the Justice and Corporate Accountability Project and co-director of the Latin American Network on Research and Education in Human Rights, where he does pro bono work for Indigenous communities in Latin America and Africa. Now, in the early 80s, he, along with young lawyers, Marika I shouldn't know how to say this, Matsu, who I believe is on this webinar today, and Marsha Matsui, helped educate the larger community about the redress issue through a group named by Shin as the Sodan Kai, or study group, very important group. So normally this award is given out every 2 years, but due to a missed pandemic year, it's going to be awarded in 2022. So finally, a word about the 75th anniversary of the NAJC, formerly the NJCCA, founded in Toronto in 1947. The Toronto NAJC will play host to a human rights symposium in partnership with the NAJC Human Rights Committee. And I have a personal motivation to serve as co-chair for the event, as my mother organized the 40th anniversary of event in 1987, which I attended. So check the Toronto NAJC website. That will be in the chat box in mid-May for details about things like the block hotel booking at the Chelsea Hotel for out-of-towners, or email me at communications@torontonhjc.ca to sign up for symposium updates. Now, Paul, I hope we have a chance to meet in Toronto. I hope you're going to come to this. And, you know, if you come here, you might be able to see the Toronto Raptors play.
Oh, yeah, that's an incentive.
I know. Their schedule isn't out yet. But anyway, if you're a basketball fan, you know, this is actually a big night for the Raptors. It's either if they lose tonight, they're out of the playoffs. So
Right.
anyway, but
well, I'm glad you didn't say the Maple Leafs.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm so excited about this performance of Hold These Truths, that it's going to be available online and as well as in person. So kudos to the Edmonton community for pulling together all these great people in Edmonton to get this first Canadian production of Hold These Truths up and running. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for spending time with us tonight. Thank you, Paul. It was fun to co-host with you. And well, have a great evening.